Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Night Talk podcast. I'm your host, Lucius Knight. On today's podcast, I feel like every episode kind of has two intros. Whatever. So on today's podcast, I discussed the philosophy of language with the professor again, the same one from the philosophy of science. And this one we kind of dive a little deeper than just language, but and I guess in the grand scheme of our conversation, I think it was necessary. But I believe that this will be a two-parter. I want to continue our conversation in a second episode to discuss topics that we didn't really get to touch upon in this episode. Episode 18. For those of you at the edge of your seats waiting for that to come out, Knight's writer, he is doing some editing on that since we're switching things up for that episode. He had his own microphone recording, so we're gonna try to combine our two audios into one to make it sound as if we're right next to each other speaking. We've never done this before, so it might take a while, so please bear with us. But hopefully episode 19 will be recorded. It might be put out before episode 18. We'll have to see. But to save us some time, there's really not much else to discuss. This is the Night Talk podcast. I hope you enjoy. So hi everybody, my name is Lucius Knight. This is the Night Talk podcast. I am here again with the professor to discuss the philosophy of language. If you just want to introduce yourself and what got you into the philosophy of language.
Yeah, thanks, Lucius. It's good to talk to you again. So language is one of the central, let's call it, distinctive characteristics of human beings as opposed to maybe anything else in the universe that we know of. That in the sense that humans have a kind of linguistic capacity that seems, as far as we can tell, unknown, unheard of elsewhere, even among other, let's say, relatively intelligent animals like dolphins. Mm-hmm. Octopuses, I've heard it's supposed to be said, other primates and so on, birds, but now to say what the differences are is you already get into some controversy. What exactly, in what sense is human language distinctive and, special? That already gets into a huge can of worms. And different people will have different views. But certainly, you just don't hear conversations in anything like the same sense. There's some kinds of seeming communication going on. There are all these metaphors like transfer of information, which is itself, to me, problematic, and we can talk about that if you want. Sort of thinking of information as kind of this bundle that you transfer from one place to another is highly misleading, even though it's practically irresistible when we think about language. Mm-hmm. But anyway, you could say what got me into it is my interest as a philosopher in understanding the mind. Language seems how should we say it? To the extent humans are intellectually distinctive, questions, and since they're also linguistically distinctive, you might partly for that reason, partly for many others, wonder about what the relationship is between linguistic abilities and various other intellectual capacities that we have. Are we able to speak language? Here's a kind of common sense view. I haven't quite gotten to what got me into it, but I'm sort of diving straight into some interesting questions, I guess. Here's a kind of view that I think a lot of philosophers have, and it's sort of common sense on some reflection, I think. We humans have all these thoughts, and then public languages, these sounds we make to convey thoughts, are just ways we've learned to conventionally signal the thoughts we're having to each other. Mm-hmm. But we can have the thoughts, and we do have the thoughts in some interesting sense, independently of our ability to encode those thoughts publicly. But that's an interesting view, and it seems very compelling. It's very hard to resist for a variety of reasons, but there are some people who think that's mistaken, that they think the ability to use language is inextricable from our general intelligence, that the idea that we could have a lot of the thoughts that we in fact do have in the absence of capacities to use language that we have is sort of a mistake. Just imagine trying to have the thought that 5,246 is larger than 5,192 without having a numerical notation, for example, and the notion of larger than that we've learned in school and so on.
Yeah.
It's just one silly example of the kind of phenomena I'm talking about that might motivate a view according to which linguistic representational phenomena aren't just these things tacked onto thought, but they're inextricably intertwined with our linguistic ability. It may be that there's no real difference between our ability to use language and our ability to think. As I say, that's one kind of view. There's extreme versions of that say language is really, the ability to think is really parasitic on language. I think the more plausible and interesting view is that, but harder to spell out, is one according to which language and thought are mutually intertwined in ways that you just can't disentangle. But then there's the more common sense view I started with, according to which we just have these thoughts in the background that then we conventionally use human languages to convey. But in some sense, we have the ability to think of the same thoughts independently of any particular convention of using language. So let me just say that's one kind of a question, is a kind of question that's just very interesting, philosophically difficult to see how you could answer in a straightforward way, using scientific experimentation. Not to say that scientific experimentation, psychological, behavioral, investigations aren't going to be relevant to figuring out all sorts of details. But you might think part of the project of understanding language in our minds is just getting some initial, maybe disentangling of what we could possibly be successful in investigating, for example, and what we could possibly come to find out. So interest in language comes from just general interest in how the mind and the world are related, which is, general interest in philosophy. Along with general interest in science in particular, you might think science is this special avenue for insight into reality, and maybe including the mind, if mind is part of reality in some to be spelled out sense, in what sense that is. And then, if so, how language and mind and reality are all intertwined.
So,
right, even thinking about reality, you might, if it's intertwined with talking about reality, you might think, well, even the project of understanding reality, in some sense, just naturally forces you to start thinking somewhat about language and how language fits with the world and the mind.
Yeah, so I'll get to the mind and reality, but I want to touch back on language and thoughts. I remember there was this case of this girl. Her parents had kept her pretty much trapped in their basement and with no access to the outside world. So she didn't have a chance to really develop or to learn how to speak or interact with other humans. And so her, I guess, mental capacity was akin to that of like maybe like a 3-year-old, and she was like 12 or something. She was older.
Yeah.
And since she wasn't taught proper language, she couldn't really interact with the world the way you would expect a girl of her age to. She couldn't, like, usually, if I remember correctly, she couldn't really speak proper sentences. The people that were working with her, they were trying their best to teach her, like math, reading, language, and all that.
Yes.
But because she wasn't...
Well, it is, there are, of course, you can't do experiments like this. That would be horrendously cruel. At least we can't currently do experiments like this, isolate children from linguistic stimuli for 10, 12 years, their initial 10, 12 years, and see what happens. But it does seem, the few cases we have, it's hard to completely disentangle, she might have been malnourished and not emotionally connected with, and so on. All sorts of other causal factors may have entered in, but the few cases we have, my impression is there are severe cognitive limitations that are permanent, that they often these unfortunate kids can't really engage linguistically the way adults normally do. There's these developmental disorders. What that says exactly, that's again part of the difficult kinds of questions that arise. I was just rereading for the first time in 30 years or something, stories about Helen Keller, where Helen Keller, the girl who, when she was about 1, I think, went blind and deaf. So it's before she could speak, well, certainly. And there's this famous episode she recounts and her teacher recounts where she's got her hand under some water and the teacher's signing her hand in shape. And it's fascinating because clearly something very dramatic happened in her mind. Like before then she could sort of signal like she wanted candy or she needed to go to the bathroom or whatever it is, she wanted to go outside. But there seems to be some fundamental difference between merely signaling, let's call them general desires or something, and the use of words to convey concepts. At least that's the impression you get from Keller, that like a switch went off in her mind and she just was standing there with her mouth open, kind of in a daze, like, oh my God, this sign means water, whatever that comes to. So it's an amazing story. The teacher noticed there was this dramatic change in her, and her behavior dramatically shifted. She wasn't just sort of this kind of wild animal that she had become for a while, maybe partly from frustration and so on, but she started, her mind could be linked to other minds in the ways that we take for granted as normal humans.
I believe that. So we all have like primal instincts and I guess primal thoughts, but like you said, with language, it's a way for us to, like the word water, we use that word to link it to, well, I think something that's water. It's really hard to describe water without language.
It may be impossible actually. This is a weird thing to say, but I'm going to try it anyway because it's something I've been thinking about lately. Can you talk about dollars without the word dollar?
I guess
it's a weird question. I mean, in some trivial sense, you can say, well, the currency used by the United States and stuff like that. But basically what I have in mind is that the word dollar, like if you ask, suppose the early Americans had used some other term to designate their currency, would dollars have just been named something else, or would they just have another currency like rubles? Rubles, we think, are a different currency from dollars. What is the difference? I mean, there are various complicated differences involving governments and so on, but basically what I'm getting at is some kinds of terms for things, in some sense, create our capacity to think about them. Coining words sometimes creates our capacity to have thoughts about certain kinds of things. And to me, dollar is a good example of that. Mm-hmm. But I think the reason I bring it up is your notion of water. It's hard to imagine what would count as thinking about water without some term, basically like water in a language.
Yeah. And just like the fact of having vocabulary to describe things, it's made me think. So since having language and having at least a minimum set of vocabulary words to use to describe or to convey your thoughts, is it wrong to think that the more versed you are in a certain language, the more words you have to convey whatever it is you want to convey? Does that necessarily mean that you are more intelligent, more educated, or it just means that you just have more ways to let people know to get your message across?
Well, if I'm getting your question right, I think it's closely related to this a kind of issue we've been talking about, which is when you learn a bunch of vocabulary. Let's say you take an economics course and then you learn, I don't know, what's some terms in economics, the velocity of money and demand and
supply and demand is pretty much
supply and so on. Price equilibrium. You learn all this technical vocabulary. That there's the view according to which we can have thoughts and then we just have to learn the vocabulary to convey the thoughts. Mm-hmm. Seems to me kind of crazy for that situation where it's not as though I could have had thoughts about supply, supplying the in a technical economist sense, let's say, or about price equilibriums without learning some economics, which is partly learning some vocabulary and then how we're supposed to deploy the vocabulary. So it's not that the idea I'm getting at, it doesn't seem like these kinds of situations are the natural, the plausible way to interpret what's going on is we had all these thoughts beforehand, but we just learned the vocabulary for conveying those thoughts. That just seems crazy to me. Just as much as the number example I gave you early on where, we can think about any number we want, but then we get this decimal notation, and then I can tell you what thoughts I've been having about the number 5,422. Mm-hmm. Okay. It's like, how could you think about the number 5,422 or whatever I said without having decimal notation? It's hard. Yeah, I don't know what that would be, I guess.
That is true. I guess so. So I guess language is just, we have these thoughts and then we need a way to convey these thoughts, and then they kind of build on top of each other where the more you learn, the more maybe not the more thoughts.
The more you learn, the more you learn how to use linguistic items in a certain pattern, arguably you acquire capacities to have thoughts that you just didn't have otherwise. Here's another analogy. Again, working with this, back to the dollar case. it would be weird to think, well, banks could have money without any particular denomination of money.
Mm-hmm.
Like you say, I have a bunch of money in the bank. And you say, oh, really? What is it in dollars, rubles, pesos? Nah, no denomination. I just have a bunch of money. Like, what would that mean? It's hard to know what that. At least we don't have a way of evaluating. Maybe there's some financial system we could have, that would allow us to make sense of that. But currently, it's hard to even know what that would come to. So basically what I'm getting at here, what I'm trying to get at is analogy between the bank is kind of like the mind, what I'm saying, and then to give the mind contents seems to require a kind of background shared practice with language of a certain sort. Maybe it's more complicated than just language, some financial practices in the bank case. And then to assign contents to your mind, for example, if you didn't speak, and I don't mean if you didn't speak in the sense of your mouth was paralyzed or something, that actually gets another complication in this whole issue, by the way. When I just said, well, I'm sort of leaving aside cases where your mouth is paralyzed, but that's the kind of a case where the mind first person, I told you, what's called the mind first advocates, the ones who think thought is largely or basically completely independently of language. They might say, no, you can't help yourself to that because your view, they say to their opponents, must be if language is so essential that somehow if your mouth gets paralyzed, somehow you can't think anymore. And that's certainly not a plausible view. Yeah. But then if you try to say what you do mean when you say, well, if you don't have the capacity to use language, it's not easy if you can spell it out at all, like what somebody who thinks language is intertwined, what they mean. You have to say some convoluted thing like, well, the person, were they to be able to signal to other people in their environment at all, they would have no capacity to say anything or some very hard to express picture. Like, what would it take for somebody? We intuitively think, gosh, if I were paralyzed, I couldn't move my limbs and so on, I could still think. And I think most people agree with that, or I might still be able to think in any case. So it's using language in some sense of actually communicating with people doesn't seem essential to thought. But nevertheless, there might be some sense in which you say, well, if I'm just laying there paralyzed, I think I have a certain kind of thought that I would express in English if only I could move my mouth. What kind of capacity do you have exactly? And that's very hard to say. I don't know if that made sense, what I just said, but basically what I'm getting at is the dispute about language first versus mind first, or at least, let's say, language and mind come together versus mind first, is hard to settle, partly because it's so hard to even say exactly what the dispute comes to. I can give you another example, by the way. I've had, rarely now, because I know people get very emotional about this, but whether animals think. I've had arguments with one of my colleagues. We get along great and so on, but he thinks it's just obvious that his dog has various thoughts. Like the mailman is at the door. And to me, it's pretty much irresistible to think, for us humans, to think, yeah, my dog thinks the mailman is at the door, or knows the mailman is at the door. But on some reflection, all I want to say is it's not obvious, and it's not even obvious what the issue is, because if do you really think the dog has the concept mailman? Human being even, it's not so clear the dog could distinguish humans from non-humans in general. whether they have the notion of male. It's very hard to believe the dog has any idea of what male is. So it's very misleading to say the dog thinks the mailman is at the door.
Okay.
So now you have to say, well, what exactly is the thought the dog has, if any thought? And it's remarkably difficult to say for any thought that animals supposedly have exactly what the thought is in English. And that's at least what it seems to me. And what I take away from that is that it's an example of how hard it is to separate. Like if the dog could speak with us and just say, yeah, it's the mailman, it's not the milkman, then you say, okay, the dog does know, does have the belief that the mailman in particular.
Okay. Well,
so anyway.
I since we are also animals, humans, I think that other animals more than likely have the capacity to think. It just might not be in the same regard that we humans think. Like with the mailman and the dog example, the dog might not, well, most certainly doesn't think mailman. It might just think human, or if it can't delineate between human and non-human, maybe just whatever its thought for a creature is, and for door is, there's some creature near its vicinity.
It's funny. So just to press on this a little bit, because that's just the kind of thing that happens in these discussions. So somebody says, well, they don't have the thought that mailman's at the door, but they have this other thought. But then to have the notion of a door, I very much doubt it. To have the notion of outside versus inside, that seems kind of abstract.
True.
Even the notion, if you say, well, there's some blob that has some dangerous nature, really to have the notion of danger in particular and nature, and if you really start being careful about what you attribute, it seems to me, here's just sort of, I'll just put an extreme alternative out there that grants, by the way, whether dogs have thoughts is a different question, whether they have conscious experiences, or at least it's arguably different. So this isn't supposed to be this what I'm discussing here isn't whether, let's say, dogs feel pain and things like that. The question is whether the dogs have thoughts. And now what that question comes to, that's a hard question, like what it even means for something to have thoughts. But getting at that question, one way to do is, well, what thought does the dog have, if any? And it seems, I want to say, impossible to spell out in English what thought the dog has. So here's an alternative where the dog doesn't have thoughts. In a certain sense, the dog finds itself excited and having the urge to bark when there's certain smells and movements in certain sounds coming from certain directions, let's say. And that's, there's no thought, the mailman's at the door, there's a dangerous creature at the door on this view, on this interpretation. I really feel like barking now, and I feel kind of excited. I mean, I'm kind of finding myself paying attention to a certain direction in the house. I say that without taking the dog to have thinking that, to have the concept house and so on, but just finding yourself, you've been agitated sometimes, or in a bad mood. You say, why are you in a bad mood? Why are you agitated? You say, I'm not really sure. I just feel agitated. Maybe that's how it is for dogs, pretty much.
So
that's how their behavior is governed.
So it could be not necessarily a conscious thing, but a subconscious reaction to information such as smells and different sights.
Well, I would say even if it's conscious, it might not be what you might call cognitive, a thought-like state.
Yeah,
it might be like more a
primal,
a pain-like, agitation, emotion-like state.
Okay. Well, I guess that kind of begs the question: what is consciousness? Is our definition or understanding of consciousness really correct? Like, would other animals have a different type of consciousness? Is there only one type of consciousness?
Yeah, well let me just say one one clarification about this. The term consciousness, there are various questions somebody might raise. Is the dog intelligent? Does the dog have a mind? Does the dog have a consciousness? Does the dog have thoughts? All of those four questions are difficult, partly because, look, what do you mean intelligent? What do you mean conscious? What do you mean has a thought? What do you mean has... So just to get some initial distinctions, I propose what's fairly standard nowadays, I think, at least among philosophers, to distinguish conscious awareness, which is something like just feeling stuff. You know, if you're aware of, if you feel pain, you're conscious in that sense. Mm-hmm. And then there can be a question, does a computer feel pain or not? Then you could say that's a version of, is it conscious? And that's supposed to be a different or distinguishable question from, leaving aside whether the dog has experiences and is conscious in that sense, does the dog have thoughts? That is, something like whatever thoughts are mental states sufficiently analogous to the ones humans have when we take ourselves to have thoughts. Do they have thoughts in that sense, even granting they have consciousness?
Do you mean thoughts as in we might think, oh, I want to, I don't know, go to the store and buy something just because? Yes,
exactly. That would be a thought. That's something that has a kind of cognitive content that then you reason about, is a kind of thing. Thoughts are distinctively, you might say, except there's some distinction between thoughts and other mental states, you might try that as an initial stab, as something like things that are reasoned with, mm-hmm. Involved in reasoning, let's say, are thoughts, whereas things that are involved maybe causally in our behavior, like feeling a pain if we touch something and it's hot, maybe that's a complicated case because sometimes we reflexively pull back before we even feel the pain. But, sometimes we go to a room and it's really hot and we then leave. We might put a coat on, not even thinking about it. We're not reasoning our way to think about the coat, and I just think, well, it's just we sort of reflexively do it when we feel the breeze, the cold breeze in the winter or something. I'm just trying to get you... humans, it's hard to separate because we do so much reasoning all the time that it's hard to give a human example of a completely reflexive, non-reasoning, process. But
could maybe a good example is whenever our phone is in our pocket and we feel it vibrate, some people will instantly go to pick it out of their pocket without really thinking about it.
Yeah, it's kind of a reflex. Yeah. See, some of those though are learned reflexes. Like a phone, somebody might say, well, initially, when you first got a phone, you might have thought really quickly, but then after a while, it just becomes this. It's like, here's another kind of case, right? When we yell, like if somebody, big person with boots on, steps on our toe, mm-hmm. we might even involuntarily go, mm-hmm. That would be an example. Like you don't think, should I yell? I mean, in some cases, at least. Sometimes you do suppress it and you consciously, if you catch yourself, you can suppress it. Uh-huh. But in some cases, you just find yourself yelling, and that's not a reasoned, that wasn't a thought, somebody is stepping on my foot, so I'm going to yell to let them know or something. It's nothing reasoning like that is involved. There's just something like a primitive reaction to pain.
Okay, so I guess kind of a choice?
Yeah.
Like say, I don't know, you're in a room and there are different foods in front of you and you have a choice to either eat one of the different foods or to not eat any of the food and leave, because you're kind of reasoning, should I eat? Should I not eat?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. That would be a deliberative reasoning case, yeah.
Well, let's just get off of dogs. What about some of the more intelligent creatures? Maybe some dolphins or elephants. It's been known, well, at least as far as I know, that chimpanzees will plan out attacks on other animals whenever they're hunting.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's an interesting. This gets into the, you might say, the current controversy that's hard to, just what should we say? It's research in progress. Whether there's something like a continuum, but that's in a way the thing is to work out. How does that continuum work? Is it a continuum? Is it a bunch of key steps, and they're just these three key moments that distinguish everything we do from, it's pretty much what any other animal can do. Like again, when we say chimpanzees plan out attacks, I would be interested in hearing how much of that is something like, well, they're doing stuff that looks kind of like what we're doing. Mm-hmm. Like, my sense is, what I've heard about research is the chimps aren't saying, you go around the back, wait 10 minutes, and then you take the rocks over there from the pond, and then you hit them with it. It's nothing like that that humans would do using language. Uh-huh. So it's something presumably with, let's call it signaling.
Yeah.
Where the chimpanzees kind of know. In fact, I was reading something about this. It might have been in a book of just about this question. This guy's views, a Berkeley neuroscientist with views about what it takes for minds to evolve. I think it was in his book. I read that chimpanzees, even though they hunt together, there's a sense in which there's a sense in which they're not hunting together in the way humans conceive hunting together, like where you have your job and I have mine, and together we carry out the task. It's more like we all chase the monkey, the monkeys we're going to eat, the other monkeys in the trees, we chase them somewhere and corral them. But then each individual just sort of does what comes natural to that individual. It isn't as though there are these complex plans. Okay, first you push them in this direction, and then I'll do this other thing, yell really loud, which will scare them, and then blah, blah. It's more, they all get in a group and hunt together spatially in that sense, but in some sense they're all kind of independent actors in another sense. Okay. Again, I don't have a precise specification of this, but it was an interesting claim that there's a sense in which even sometimes animals who hunt in packs, for example, they don't coordinate their activities in the way we humans would just find it very natural to coordinate our activities.
Okay. That would make sense. I guess I have one question and a follow-up statement. Maybe I guess their level of consciousness or their level of planning or reasoning might not be as high, or obviously it's not as high as humans, but they might have some form of consciousness that is not on par with ours, and in regards to them not necessarily always following through with a plan, the same could be said with humans. We, for the most part, when humans make a plan, they try to follow through, or each person has their part and they stay to that part, but as we all know, it doesn't always happen that way.
Right. No, but the difference is supposed to be, I take it, is that humans intuitively, they can tell us, look, why did you not do what was part of the plan? And then they'll say either, well, I chickened out, or I saw that there was this even better antelope on the other side, or whatever. Mm-hmm. Whereas this is supposed to be, it's not like they decided not to go with the plan. The idea is supposed to be there is no plan other than kind of collectively chase the thing and then hope you get dinner, hope you get to eat at the end of it, kind of thing.
Okay. So maybe some more of a primal.
Yeah, it's less of a, the very idea of collaboration is more complicated, and even though humans, it's so basic to us that we take it for granted, according to this author anyway, whose name I forget at the moment. He thinks that's a fundamental separator of humans from other creatures, this capacity to act collaboratively in a certain distinctive way.
Okay. And this kind of leads me back to what you had mentioned when we first started, how to plan something, or just to speak, or to have language. You said that it's really easy for people to say that it's just a transfer of information, and
yes,
I can see why, because it really does seem like you have an idea, you have a thought, and you've learned some type of language, English, Spanish, whatever, and you want to convey the thought that is in your mind to somebody else. And language is I lost track of the word, but language is a form that you use to convey that thought or information to that other person.
And that's, that leads to a very intuitive picture we have of language. I make some sounds. The sounds carry this meaning over to your ears, and then, in some sense, once it gets in your head, it pushes the meaning, and then the meaning that used to be in my head also goes into your head, roughly. Mm-hmm. It's a very intuitive picture, but on some reflection, it seems highly misleading, I guess, to many people. So here's another analogy using banks. So suppose I pay you $100 and I have my bank transfer $100 from my account to your account. Mm-hmm. Intuitively, what's happened is that there are these things. There's this chunk of money. I don't know what it looks like, but I might have some visions of a stack of bills or something.
Yeah.
Somehow gets pushed from some vault somewhere into some other vault somewhere.
Yeah.
But in fact, we know that's not what happens, right? Mm-hmm. What happens is some electronic pulses get emitted in various patterns, and then the pattern in my bank changes in a certain way, such that when I quote-unquote check my balance, it says, $100 less, so to speak, than it used to. And your balance says $100 more than it used to. Mm-hmm. If you say, okay, what exactly was transferred? Well, in some sense, some energy was transferred back and forth across some wires.
Yeah.
But it's not as though there's this thing, the $100, that as a chunk got transferred in anything except this mental picture we form of sort of a useful heuristic to imagine what's going on.
Okay.
It's almost as though, like, the primitive understanding we have is, I give you some bananas and there's this chunk of things that I can literally hand to you, and then you have the chunk of things. But then that metaphor becomes fundamental the way we conceive a lot of interactions, including linguistic ones. And what I want to say is the bank analogy seems to me kind of apt, similarly, for what's going on when we talk to each other. There's some stuff going on in my brain. I produce some sounds. Some stuff goes on in your brains. But the thought that there's some packet of stuff that gets transferred somehow from my mouth to your ear seems completely wrong in some sense.
Okay,
other than metaphorically.
Yeah, so it's just, I guess, a more abstract understanding where I have a thoughts, neurons firing off in my brain. I make these sounds, they reverberate through the air. Your ears pick up the sounds, then your brain categorizes those sounds as quote-unquote information, and then you then have a sort of mental picture of what it is I was trying to say. Is that...
Yeah, something happens in my mind and or brain, but again, this picture of there's this thing that's inside my brain now that used to be inside your brain that got transferred across the air,
Mm-hmm.
is what I'm just raising.
Okay, I understand.
Raising doubts about. Yeah.
Okay. And there's a lot that we could cover. So, would you mind having like a two-parter where we discuss more at a later date?
Sure, that'd be fine.
Yeah, because I wanted to go into body language and how that plays a part into language.
Okay, yeah, I have to say that's not something I know a hell of a lot about, so somebody else might be better for body language stuff.
And I guess other forms of language, that I guess quote unquote language, such as art or music.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
I don't plan to do that now, but I wanted to go back to what you had mentioned about the mind, and if it's a part of reality, and are mind, language, and reality intertwined? If you could, I guess, elaborate on those two concepts.
Yeah, so there's a pretty widespread view nowadays, according to which, I forget if this came up in our last discussion, but broadly, let's call it physicalism.
Mm-hmm.
There's a bunch of particles buzzing around, bouncing off each other, and physics gives us the laws of it, and that's the real ultimate truth about reality. And so everything else that's true about reality, including, if it is true, that we have minds and consciousness, must somehow be a result or somehow be analyzable or reducible, is a fancy term sometimes used, to the, these particle motion patterns or what have you. So on that view, then you say, well, if there are minds, which many people take to be just obviously, each of us, many people would say, know of our own minds that we exist. How we know that other minds exist is an issue, but we know each of us knows we're conscious, somebody might say.
Mm-hmm.
So we know that there's at least one, each of us knows there's at least one mind out there. How is it related to brain activity, which presumably the thought is brain activity can be reduced or completely analyzed in terms of physical goings-on of particles?
Mm-hmm.
How to explain the mind in those terms? I myself, this is one of my things I've been struggling with, and who knows if I'll ever have any, helpful insights about it, but I'm skeptical of that picture now, that there's that physics gives us the truth about reality. But it's basically just, I don't know that I can explain or defend it in a sort of shortish interview, but just to get a kind of sense of the sort of thing I'm suspicious about is, I don't think that thought and language phenomena, as we understand them, are reducible to physics, are explainable in terms of physics. In fact, there's a sense in which language and thought phenomena are just different kinds of things from physics phenomena, I want to say. Sort of believe that because it's misleading. It's not that my view isn't coming from somebody who says, well, there's an immaterial soul or something like that. That's not the kind of view I'm having. It's more like, let's go back to the dollar transfer,
Mm-hmm.
the $100 transfer from my bank to yours. If somebody says, well, the $100 transfer is really just a sequence of particle movement patterns. To me, that seems very misleading and confused. I want to say, yeah, of course, when we say there was a transfer, we also think there were a bunch of electronic pulses that happened, presumably.
Uh-huh.
They don't have to be. I mean, in a more primitive, prior to electricity, there were banks. So sometimes it's just people writing stuff with ink on some papers in various places, and then people forming various beliefs and practices involving those. Anyway, but the thought that there's any interesting connection between the electrical, or sorry, let's just call the physics patterns on one hand and the cognitive patterns on the other, I'm suspicious that we shouldn't expect there to be a nice analysis of mind and meaning phenomena in terms of physics. That's basically, I don't know if that helps at all, but that's where I, in particular, am skeptical of a very widespread view according to which everything that's out there in the world has to be analyzable in terms of the ultimate constituents reality, namely the physical constituents.
Okay. I'm still a little confused. So do you mean like thoughts, like the multiple signals being pulsed in our mind, neurons firing, that can't be broken down in terms of physics? Or do you mean
whether a thought we're having is true is not a physical property of the brain. So here's a kind of, there's something called the Naturalizing Semantics Project.
Uh-huh.
So here's a kind of question that arises from a certain point of view. Look, human beings evolved, and their brains are these physical objects, and gradually these physical objects acquired the capacity to think.
Mm-hmm.
Our ancestors did, let's say. And whatever that comes to, interesting question, unresolved question, but let's suppose our ancestors did, so their brains somehow changed to enable them to think. So there must be, for that reason, something like a story about what's physically required in order, what thinking comes to in physics terms. And what I suspect is that idea is misguided. In kind of like in a very abstract sense, in a similar way that thinking a chunk of something was transferred from my bank to your bank.
Mm-hmm.
What's the chunk made of in terms of physics? If you're like, well, no, there is no chunk from a certain point of view. The whole idea of analyzing a chunk of that sort doesn't make sense. It's inappropriate. It's misleading. And that's similarly, I want to say, with things like thoughts and their truth and their meanings are similarly, it's a mistaken thought that there should be a story in terms of physics about the nature of thinking and truth.
Okay.
And meaning.
I think
and then hence language.
Starting to understand. So when
it is very hard to say. It's one of those, I'm not sure how much it would be helpful to get into that particular bit of, what I'm thinking about, but just to tell you, there is this issue out there. Is everything reducible to physics, including truth, including meaning, including language, including thought? And I, myself, am one of those who are suspicious that no, that there isn't a good story to be told. But I'm also, I resist it for different reasons from the ones most people do. Sometimes there are religious motivations for resisting it.
Mm-hmm.
It's fairly common. Sometimes there's just intuitive motivations, like we know with certainty that our consciousness exists, whereas we don't know with certainty anything about physics. So it somehow seems crazy to be, it's hard to believe that, let's say, when you peel a tangerine and you get that sense that
mm-hmm.
the conscious feeling you get, let's call it conscious sensation you have of the tangerine oil, I guess, with a distinctive scent, that what that is in some sort of absolute metaphysical sense just is a bunch of particles moving in some pattern.
Mm-hmm.
Some people think, they just don't see how that could possibly ever be made intelligible, made understandable. This gets into the problem of consciousness, of let's call it phenomenology. Why should there be any consciousness in the world? This connects to a more common reason than mine for thinking not everything reduces to physics. Why should any entity in the universe be conscious? It seems like the standard, even evolutionary explanation, as long as it doesn't require consciousness, as long as there's the right kind of reactivity patterns, things will survive or not, right? Even if all animals were just unconscious robots, as long as they acted in the same way they actually do, they move their bodies in the same way they actually do, what good is consciousness?
I've actually thought about that myself. Just want a quick explanation before we jump into my last points of discussion. So I guess my understanding of everything, so the universe started, it was a bunch of gas, and the gas came to form together, and then stars were formed, and then they exploded, and then new elements came about. And basically, things became more and more complex. Like with life, they were just simple organisms, and then they became multicellular organisms, and then you have water-based life forms, and then plants, and then land-based life forms, and then now you have us. I hypothesized that we could just be the next step in complexity. What's going to happen afterwards, I don't know. Nobody knows. But I also could be completely wrong. I just think that maybe consciousness or humanity, with what we've accomplished, is just the next step in what it seems to be an increasing form of complexity.
Well, that's in a way, though, just to say how I'm thinking this other thought some people have about the irreducibility of physics of consciousness. They're going to typically think complexity isn't going to get you consciousness. I mean, let's take a bunch of marbles. Mm-hmm. Imagine somebody said, well, this marble in my hand, is it conscious? You say, well, I kind of doubt it. Somebody says, well, let me add another marble. It's more complex. Now is it conscious? Hard to see why there should be any explanation of why suddenly a spark of consciousness should arise. And roughly, I'm just going to do that, a gazillion times. Okay, now I've got 17,400,292 marbles. If you want to order them in your yard, however you want, or over the state of Texas, however much space it would take, arrange the things however you want in any complex pattern and springs and so on. Why should any of that have any bearing on any consciousness ever existing? That's the kind of question they're liable to raise. And many people remain puzzled, myself included, by the way, how physical complexity could make intelligible why there should be consciousness. Now, let me contrast that with, it could just turn out, it could turn out that when I say open sesame over here at my house, your car starts honking. It could just turn out that's the way the world is, When I say open sesame in my room over in Round Rock, your car doors. Somebody says, well, that's, here's the way the world happened. There's the Big Bang, more complex stuff was produced. And then eventually, Corey arose, and then when he says open sesame, Lucius's car starts honking. I feel like, well, that's a description of, we all kind of can agree maybe the world turned out the way it did, with consciousness in this case. But it's not, that's different from explaining why it should be. right? It's one thing to say, it just turns out whenever Corey says open sesame, this completely unrelated thing seems to happen, namely Lucius's car starts to honk. And I'm assuming, like, we keep investigating, we don't find any hidden, phone, Bluetooth connection between, my phone and my voice in your car and stuff. Say, no, I don't have the phone or anything. I just, anytime I say open sesame and I'm in a certain room in my house, your car doors, and that's just the way it is. You feel like, well, the world may be that way, but don't say that it's then explained or made intelligible. It's at best just, well, here's the thing. When you have, just turns out when one person makes a certain sound and this other completely unrelated thing happens. That's weird, but that's the way the world is. So similarly, you could just think, look, put enough marbles in a vat with oil of a certain kind, and then you heat it to exactly 32.15 degrees. Consciousness arises. That's cool. I mean, that could turn out to be the case, but that's different from making intelligible. Like, why the hell that kind of oil and those kinds of marbles? Like, what would possibly make sense of the sensation of a green, or purple, or a smell of a tangerine, or the sound of a violin, or a headache, all these different conscious phenomena? Why should any of that have any relationship whatever to any particular physical configuration? That's what these people are liable to press on.
Yeah.
And again, it's easy to think there's an answer by just saying, well, you just kept getting a bunch more complexity, and then now we have consciousness. Somehow or other, consciousness came into being. And the irreducibilists say, yeah, we grant consciousness came into being. We just don't think there's any possible physics explanation of consciousness, nevertheless. Okay. Other than the trivial kind that we could say, well, why did Lucius's car start honking? Oh, it's because Corey said open sesame again, and this completely other thing happened. You say, well, we know there's a regularity there. So similarly, the analogy is supposed to be, there seems to be a regularity between growing into a normal adult human being, or even a small child, and being conscious. It seems like there's a correlation. That's like learning there's a correlation between saying open sesame and your car door honking. But noting that there is a correlation is very different from explaining why there should be such a correlation.
Okay. That, I believe I understand what you're trying to get at.
Good.
That is something I would have to dive much deeper into. I haven't really thought about that too much. We could possibly discuss that the next time. But the last thing I want to get into...
it's a deep question. That's sometimes called the hard problem of consciousness. Is just that problem.
Gotcha.
That's what the so-called hard problem of consciousness is, I would say. Anyway, sorry, you were going to say something else?
Yeah. So language is kind of the way it's pretty much understood, the middleman for me getting my thought or whatever it is I want to convey into your mind. But language as we have it now is imperfect. With just like auditory language, we could paint a picture and also say what it is we want to say. But what if we could forego all of that and basically just do a mind-to-mind transfer, where I don't have to say a single word?
That's a fascinating question. I don't know that I haven't thought about that enough, is the short answer. I'd love to have a better... I hope I have an answer sometime, but I don't really. I think it's a great question. Mm-hmm. Like what it would be to telepathically communicate in a way that wasn't. Like, here's one thing I can easily imagine. You probably can too. I hear your voice, mm-hmm. as it were, in my mind saying, hey, do you want to have another discussion? Mm-hmm. And then I just think to myself, sure, Lucius, I'll have another one. And then you say, okay, great. And then when I talk to you, you say, oh, yeah, I heard you and you heard me, right? You say, wow, that's amazing. We telepathically communicated. but the situation I'm envisaging, that form of telepathy still involves
Language.
something, let's call it qualitatively very much like linguistic auditory communication.
Mm-hmm.
The weirder thing that's harder to understand for me that I don't know what to make of is if somebody says, no, imagine you just communicate without any language whatever. That I have much harder time understanding what that could come to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Since, like, I've thought about this briefly after I listened to this podcast called, I think it was Limetown, where they basically invented a device where you could communicate with other people with the same device through your mind. But I started to think, what if we were born like that? And like, since we use language to speak, since we can't do the mind-to-mind transfer, so what if we could do that, where I don't have to tell you I'm sad, I just think it's, and you feel my sadness, or I don't have to tell you I'm hungry, I just think it's, but like it wouldn't be with words. It, I guess, would be, what the technical difficulties, folks. Seems we accidentally hung up on each other. One sec. Hello?
Hey, yeah, sorry we got disconnected after you were talking about just feeling something and then
Yeah.
the other person having the thought.
Yeah, so for instance, if I wanted to tell you I'm hungry, let's go get something to eat, it wouldn't, me doing the mind-to-mind transfer telepathically speaking to you, it wouldn't be through the use of words or language. I'm guessing it'll be more of just feelings.
Well, it's funny. I mean, imagine this in a way reconnects to some of the earlier discussion, which is how independent thought is from language.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you have a fairly, I guess, maybe extreme, or at least maybe even it's the common sense view that thought is completely independent of language, you might think, yeah, I just don't see what the problem is. I just have the thought, let's go out to eat, and then you somehow or other know it's that very thought. But let's go back to the mailman example, just because I think it's relevant to this. Suppose I get some feeling. I say, Lucia's trying to communicate with me. I'm getting a feeling. Now, what kind of feeling is supposed to help me know that your thought is, let's go get pizza, let's say, versus let's go get seafood? Like, there could be, again, something like a linguistic convention where when you convey the fishy smell to me telepathically, mm-hmm. I just know, okay, that's his convention for let's go to get seafood. But then that looks a lot more like language again. Mm-hmm. You say, well, no, it's not even like that. There's no convention. I just give you some sensations, but somehow that is somehow intrinsically supposed to convey that you want to go to the Pizza Hut on Main Street at 3:40 p.m. I don't see how that's supposed to work, I guess.
Yeah.
I have no idea how that's supposed to work.
Yeah.
I don't know what I'm supposed to imagine, I guess. Yeah.
It really is difficult without using language, even with mind-to-mind transfer. Better yet, I had mentioned with art earlier, if we could say I'm thinking of a red ball, the red ball in my mind is going to be completely different from the red ball in your mind. Could be different size, different texture, different material, the room that it's in, if it's even in a room. is going to be different than from what you're picturing. And with a mind-to-mind transfer, that could be more easily conveyed. But then again, if I want to truly show you what I'm imagining, I could probably draw it, and then you could see, oh, so that's what Lucius was trying to say, or I could thoroughly explain what I want you to see.
Well, that, weirdly, I can I feel like I can imagine, if you imagine a visual image, like you imagine a green circle inside a red patch or something that fills up 40% of your visual field or something, I can imagine kind of like an internal TV set forming, and then I imagine the similar image on it, and then we find that we can both draw the same image, even without verbal contact. You say, oh, wow, I conveyed that telepathically. But I guess even that, it seems like a different phenomenon to me from conveying of thoughts in the sense of, I guess, I don't know what, imagine trying to communicate what you want to do or what's true by just giving me images of various sorts.
That would be...
It's a hard question to raise because, again, we're going to run into the problem of if there are enough conventional learned associations with the images, you could do it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You basically, if the images become like iconic language, like hieroglyphic sort of representations of things, like, I was thinking about physics today and early cosmology, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how would you convey that using an image, that particular thought? I have no idea.
I mean, I'm sure it could be done. I mean, there are in our age, where cartoons where there's no audio, there's not even music, but you can still understand what's going on. But it would be difficult since it's not something that we don't really do. We don't do mind-to-mind transfers of information. So I was just wondering.
It's interesting you say we know what's going on, because often we would describe the situation as one in which we know what's going on. But really, if we ask, let's say we're watching a silent movie with Charlie Chaplin.
Mm-hmm.
We can say, he's thinking, wow, the bully's really big or something. But it's not as though we think we can read the details of his thoughts, or of anybody else for that matter.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like only via them telling us, he looks as big as, that football player I saw the other day or whatever. That's a particular thought he might have. But you would have no way of conveying that just by watching Charlie Chaplin do his funny movements, right?
Mm-hmm.
You'd have some vague sense of, he's worried about the bully hitting him or something. Or, I haven't seen a Charlie Chaplin movie in forever, but whatever he's doing, the woman's pretty or whatever,
So it might be
being on top of this building is scary,
It might be more of a vague sensation than precise language. But again, might also not be. I really have no idea. It's just something that I just started to think about recently. I wanted to get you into that.
I think you're right. I mean, imagine a movie where they just show somebody sort of walking day after day in the desert, and then they show them seeing a big fountain of water. We kind of all know that's super salient for such a person. Such a person is liable to be extremely thirsty and really want the water and stuff like that, and that's not so vague. That would be like the overriding desire they're liable to have. So those kinds of things, they're just sort of universal patterns of human behavior we can interpret from these kinds of, non-verbally augmented descriptions, so to speak, just visual. But so it's not exactly a vagueness issue. It's just there's very limited, I want to say, what you can convey with just using images like that. That aren't linguistic, linguistic items, so to speak, whatever that is, whatever it is, the linguistic item.
I all I have for now. Thank you for joining me, Professor.
Thank you. Nice talking to you again. And yeah, if you want to do another one, I'm happy to do that sometime.
Yeah, I'll get this edited and uploaded, and I'll send it to you. I will not forget this time. Sorry, I forgot last time.
Oh no, well, great. Yeah, I enjoyed the last time. So
yeah,
let's hope we both sound even better this time.
I'm sure.
All right, Lucius. Thanks a lot, man.
Have a good one.
Take it easy. Bye.
Bye. All right, so that was a professor from the University of Texas. He teaches philosophy of science, and the philosophy of language. I believe other subjects, but I'm not sure. I have not checked up on that since I last looked him up. I will try to get another interview with the people that I wanted to interview before. I really do want to interview a racist because I want to know what their thought process is. And by racist, honestly, a racist could be of any race, and a religious figure, and anybody else you guys think that I should interview, or anybody else that I eventually think of interviewing. But this has been a Night Talk podcast. I really do hope you enjoy listening. Thanks to all the people that have subscribed and to people that actually listen to the show. I hope you find it entertaining. I hope you either learn something, maybe not learn something, but at least have some new thoughts or new ideas or new things that you want to think about. And if anything you want to discuss or want to hear discussed, just leave a comment and we'll be sure to discuss them, and I'll be sure to actually check the comments. But yeah, this has been a Night Talk podcast. I hope you enjoy. Peace.